the dawn of the 12th century, after the First Crusades had exhausted both Europe and the East alike, a small band of knights emerged upon the stage, men unlike any others of their age. They were not merely warriors, nor were they simply monks. Rather, they sought to combine two seemingly irreconcilable worlds: the austerity of devout faith on one hand, and the gleam of the sword on the other. These men would later be known as the Knights Templar, or in Latin, Fratres Templari, the Brothers of the Temple. Their beginnings trace back to around 1119, when a French knight named Jacques de Molay gathered 8 companions and pledged their lives to a singular cause: the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, a city that had fallen into Crusader hands. Many pilgrims were vulnerable to ambush, robbery, and death upon the perilous roads. It was here that the vision was born. These knights would become guardians of the way. Men who would live in poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet also bear the sword to defend the defenseless. Because they established their headquarters on Jerusalem's Temple Mount, believed to hold the ruins of Solomon's ancient temple, the people named them the Knights of the Temple, or simply the Templars. In time, this name would become one of the most renowned in all medieval history. In their early years, they possessed neither wealth nor influence. They lived in stark simplicity. Some chronicles even claim that 2 knights would share a single horse, a symbol of their poverty and humility. Yet with the passage of decades, this humble brotherhood would undergo a dramatic transformation, rising into a formidable force of immense wealth, vast armies, and impregnable castles. But before such power could be attained, recognition was essential. It came through the intervention of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most prominent churchmen of his time. Bernard wrote passionately in their defense, calling them Knights of Christ, men unlike worldly warriors who fought for pride or temporal gain. These knights, he argued, fought for faith, salvation, and the glory of God. With Bernard's endorsement, the Knights Templar received the official blessing of the Church and were formally recognized as a religious military order. And so, from a small circle of humble men, the legend of the Templars began to carve its path into history. After their official recognition by the Catholic Church, the Templars were no longer just a small band of men. They became a true institution, with roots extending deep into both Europe and the East. The Church granted them sweeping privileges, the right to collect donations, exemption from local taxes, and independence from secular authorities. They answered directly to the Pope in Rome, and to no other. This unprecedented privilege made them a power beyond challenge. While feudal armies were often fragmented by shifting loyalties among nobles, the Templars were a unified order, bound by strict rules, obedient only to their Grand Master and the will of the Pope. Over time, their role expanded far beyond guarding pilgrims. They became central figures in the Great Crusades, always in the front lines of battle, heavily armored, disciplined with iron will. Chroniclers, both Muslim and Christian, described them as among the fiercest and most disciplined fighters of their age. But their strength was not limited to the battlefield. They also became masters of finance. With donations pouring in from kings and nobles of Europe to support the Crusades, the Templars amassed vast wealth. Yet they did not simply hoard it. They established what may well have been the world's first international banking system. Pilgrims traveling from England or France no longer had to risk carrying gold or silver across dangerous lands. Instead, they could deposit their wealth at a Templar house in Europe, receive a written document, and then withdraw their funds upon arrival in Jerusalem. In this way, the Templars pioneered advanced methods of financial transfer, placing themselves in a unique position between church, merchants, and kings. In time, even monarchs themselves borrowed money from the Templars. The King of England, the King of France, and even the papacy in Rome all dealt with the order as though it were a vast transcontinental bank. Yet such economic power did not go unnoticed. What had begun as a symbol of poverty and sacrifice now stirred envy and suspicion. Many came to see them not merely as holy warriors, but as men of immense wealth and influence, men who owned castles and fortresses, who controlled trade routes, and who collected revenues for their own purposes. In the east, their strongholds multiplied along the Levantine coast. They built massive fortresses such as Safed and Crac des Chevaliers, some of which still stand in Syria to this day. These castles were like fortified islands amid a sea of Islamic territory, and though the Crusades suffered defeats and setbacks, the Templars fought on to the very end, holding firm to their creed. No surrender, no retreat, even unto death. But the world was changing. When the Muslims, under the leadership of Saladin, recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, the slow decline began. Even so, the Templars remained indispensable, both militarily and politically. They were like a double-edged sword, on one hand an invincible force, on the other a wealthy and secretive order that stirred unease in both kings and the church. This mixture of power and mystery would prove to be the seed of their tragic downfall. Despite the image of great wealth and military might that surrounded them, life inside the Templar order was neither easy nor luxurious. The knights lived under a strict code crafted by Bernard of Clairvaux himself, known as the Rule of the Temple. This code was like a constitution dictating every detail of their daily lives with uncompromising precision. A Templar knight lived much like a monk. He was forbidden to own anything personally. All he possessed belonged to the order. They often slept fully clothed, ready at a moment's notice for battle. Absolute obedience to their commander was the foundation of their discipline. Harsh as it was, this lifestyle elevated their image in the Christian world. They were seen as pure knights, men who abandoned worldly pleasures for the defense of faith. Their motto reflected this spirit. Not to us, O Lord, not to us. but to your name be the glory." They had unusual customs. If a knight fell in battle, his brothers would not retrieve the body until the fighting had ceased. No life was to be risked for a corpse, no matter how beloved the fallen. Such severity was part of their hard military character. Their food was austere. Meat was allowed only twice a week, often mutton. On other days, they subsisted on vegetables, grains, and bread. Sugar was strictly forbidden. Even the colors of their clothing carried symbolic weight. White for the knights, symbolizing purity. A red cross on the chest, symbolizing readiness to shed blood. And black for the serving brothers or non-combatant brethren. These rigid rules forged an army of discipline unlike any other in medieval Europe. While feudal knights flaunted pride, arrogance, and ornate armor, the Templars became a unified military machine. No vanity, no personal glory, only the order. Yet, as wealth poured into the order and their political influence grew, the discipline began to erode. No longer did all see them as humble monks in armor. Critics accused them of hypocrisy. How could they call themselves poor while owning lands, castles, and vast treasures? Thus, suspicion began to encircle the order, suspicions that in time would become accusations and eventually the pretext for their ruin. The Knights Templar were at the very heart of the Crusades. No major battle was fought without them. Their name became synonymous with the crusading wars themselves. They were the shock troops, the vanguard who advanced before all others, often the first to charge and the last to retreat. Their most defining moment on the battlefield came in their clash with the great Muslim commander, Saladin. In 1187, the two forces met at the Battle of Hattin, a turning point that would forever alter the history of the Middle East. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan of Jerusalem, and joined by the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, was large. Yet they made a fatal mistake. They abandoned the water sources and marched into the dry plains beneath the burning July sun. Saladin, with cunning and patience, encircled them, cutting them off from water. Then, when exhaustion and thirst had weakened them, he struck. The result was catastrophe. Thousands of crusaders were slain. Most of their leaders were captured. The Templars, however, faced a fate even harsher. Chroniclers recount that Saladin ordered the execution of nearly all the captured Templars, regarding them as the fiercest and most fanatical of his enemies. The defeat at Hattin was not just a military loss. It shattered the prestige of the Crusader states and exposed the vulnerability of the entire crusading effort. Shortly thereafter, Jerusalem itself fell back into Saladin's hands after nearly 88 years of Crusader control. Yet the Templars did not vanish. They regrouped, and when the Third Crusade was launched under Richard the Lionheart of England, they once again proved their valor. Richard relied heavily upon them in his campaigns against Saladin's forces. Though they fought bravely, they could not recapture Jerusalem. With the gradual collapse of the Crusader kingdoms in the Levant, the Templars' military power waned. They moved their headquarters to Acre, which became their main stronghold. But when Acre fell to the Mamluks in 1291, it marked the end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Driven from the very soil that had given them purpose, the Templars were forced to withdraw entirely from the East. But instead of dissolving into obscurity, they returned to Europe, wealthy, experienced, and still formidable. There, a new and more dangerous chapter of their history began. When the last Crusader stronghold at Acre fell in 1291, the Templars' mission in the East was effectively over. They had lost the land that had given them purpose, and with it, the holy cause for which they were founded. Yet they did not dissolve. Instead, they withdrew into Europe, carrying with them their immense wealth, their administrative skills, and their reputation as seasoned warriors. In Europe, the Templars owned lands stretching across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and beyond. Their network of fortresses, estates, and commanderies functioned almost like a state within a state, independent, wealthy, and answerable only to the Pope. But in this very strength lay the seeds of their destruction. For though they no longer fought in the East, their financial and political power in the West continued to grow. Kings and nobles had borrowed heavily from the Templars, and many were now deeply indebted to them. Among these kings was Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Though remembered for his elegant appearance, he was also shrewd, ambitious, and ruthless. Philip found himself heavily indebted to the Templars, and moreover, he coveted their vast wealth. At the same time, he distrusted their independence, for here was a military order within his kingdom that acknowledged no authority but the Pope. Unable to tolerate such a force, Philip resolved upon their destruction. But he knew that mere politics or debts were not enough. He needed a pretext that would turn both church and people against them. Rumors began to spread, whispers that the Templars had strayed from the faith, that in their secret initiation rites they denied Christ, spat upon the cross, and worshipped strange idols. Such accusations, though unproven, found fertile ground among those already suspicious of the order's wealth and secrecy. Philip pressed the Pope, Clement V, who at that time lived not in Rome but in Avignon under French influence, to take action. Caught between the pressure of the French crown and the authority of the Church, Clement reluctantly yielded. Thus began one of the most infamous trials in medieval history, the suppression of the Knights Templar. On the dawn of Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that would forever live in infamy, King Philip IV of France struck. In a coordinated move across his realm, royal officials arrested hundreds of Templars simultaneously. The charges were shocking: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, and unnatural practices. The suddenness of the arrests stunned all of Europe. The once mighty Knights of the Temple, who had stood as guardians of Christendom for nearly 2 centuries, were now dragged in chains, humiliated before the people they had sworn to protect. Interrogations began immediately. Under the brutal hand of the Inquisition, confessions were extracted. Confessions of spitting upon the cross, of denying Christ, of obscene rituals in the dark of night. Yet historians agree, most of these admissions were born not of truth, but of torture. The rack, the lash, the flame, these were the tools that forced proud knights into words they did not mean. The Pope himself, Clement V, wavered. At first he resisted, doubting the charges, but Philip pressed him relentlessly. To defy the king risked shattering the fragile alliance between papacy and crown, and so, reluctantly, Clement authorized the trials to proceed under papal authority. Across France and soon in other kingdoms, the Templars were tried. Some recanted their forced confessions, insisting upon their innocence. Yet to retract was perilous, for those who denied guilt after confession were deemed relapsed heretics, and the punishment for relapse was death by fire. Thus, flames rose in Paris and beyond. Templars who held firm to their order's honor were tied to stakes and consumed by the fire, their cries mingling with prayers to God. The order that had once terrified the East now found itself defenseless before its own brethren in the West. Still, the trials dragged on for years, spreading from France to England, Spain, and beyond. Not all rulers were eager to follow Philip's lead. Some doubted the charges, some envied the wealth, while others sought to seize Templar properties for themselves. What united them was less a belief in guilt and more a hunger for gain. At last, the fate of the entire order was sealed. In 1312, under immense pressure from Philip, Pope Clement V formally dissolved the Knights Templar. Their lands and wealth were largely transferred to the rival order of the Hospitallers, though much was quietly absorbed by kings and nobles. But even with their dissolution, one last act of defiance would etch the Templars forever into legend. Even after the dissolution of the order, its leaders still awaited their fate. Among them was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. For nearly 7 years he lingered in captivity, enduring humiliation, interrogations, and broken promises of mercy. At last, in March of 1314, judgment was passed in Paris. Molay, along with several senior officers, was condemned as a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death by fire. On the evening of March 18th, 2 great pyres were erected on an island in the River Seine, within sight of Notre Dame Cathedral. Crowds gathered to witness the final spectacle. Bound hand and foot, Jacques de Molay was led to the stake. Yet he did not weep nor beg for pardon. Instead, he proclaimed his innocence and the innocence of his order before all who listened. Raising his voice against both king and pope, he declared, "God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon misfortune will come to those who have condemned us unjustly." Then the flames consumed him. Chroniclers tell that he died with dignity, his voice carrying across the river until it was lost to the roar of fire. In the months and years that followed, many whispered of a curse. Philip IV, the king who destroyed the Templars, died later that same year, struck down suddenly while hunting. Pope Clement V also perished within weeks, consumed by illness. And soon after, Philip's royal line itself collapsed into turmoil, earning the dynasty the name the Accursed Kings. Thus ended the Order of the Knights Templar, an end as dramatic and mysterious as their rise. Yet their story did not vanish with the ashes of Jacques de Molay. Instead, it lived on, transformed into legend. Though the Order of the Templars was destroyed by fire and decree, their memory refused to die. Instead, it grew larger than life, cloaked in mystery and legend. People whispered that the Templars had guarded immense treasures, gold, relics, and sacred artifacts hidden away before their fall. Some claimed they had discovered the Holy Grail itself, or even the Ark of the Covenant, during their years on the Temple Mount. To this day, countless tales speak of buried Templar treasure, concealed in castles, cathedrals, or far-off lands. Others insisted that the Templars had not vanished at all, that survivors fled in secret to Scotland, to Portugal, or across the seas, preserving their brotherhood under new guises. In Portugal, in fact, King Denis transformed the remnants of the Templars into a new order, the Order of Christ, which went on to play a central role in the Great Age of Exploration. In later centuries, as secret societies emerged in Europe, many sought to trace their lineage back to the Templars. The most famous of these claims lies with the Freemasons, who embraced symbols and myths that echoed the legacy of the Temple. Whether true or not, such connections only deepened the aura of secrecy surrounding the Knights. Writers, poets, and chroniclers alike found in the Templars a fertile ground for imagination. Monks in armor, warriors bound by oath, martyrs betrayed by king and pope. Their sudden rise and tragic fall captured the medieval imagination and have continued to haunt the modern one. Today, the Red Cross of the Templars remains one of the most recognizable emblems of the Middle Ages. Historians debate their true role. Were they saints or sinners, protectors or power seekers? Perhaps they were all these things at once. What cannot be denied is that from humble beginnings on the Temple Mount, they became a force that shaped 2 centuries of history. And though their order was crushed, their name endures, half in fact, half in legend, forever bound to the mysteries of the past.